Robert Turner was the man everyone thought they knew. Confident, charming, but secretly unfaithful. Linda Turner was the wife who stood by him through scandal, trial, and 15 years of prison. To neighbors, she was the picture of loyalty, waiting patiently for his return. But what no one realized was that Linda wasn't waiting for a reunion. She was waiting for revenge. And the moment Robert walked out of prison, his freedom became nothing more than a countdown to his death. Robert Turner had always been the kind of man who carried himself with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried a reputation as someone who knew how to take control of any room he walked into. To the people who knew him only in passing, Robert seemed successful and charismatic, the kind of man others wanted to follow. His wife, Linda, by contrast, was soft-spoken and reserved, almost invisible when standing beside him. They had been married for nearly 20 years, building a life together in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. To outsiders, their life appeared stable, even enviable. A nice house, a steady income, and a marriage that had endured the trials of time. But appearances can be deceiving, and in the Turner household, deception ran deep. Linda had suspected for years that Robert was unfaithful, but she carried her suspicions silently, never confronting him. She saw the late nights, the excuses about extra shifts at work, the sudden attention to his appearance, and she knew something wasn't right. Still, she kept her composure, playing the part of the devoted wife. Behind her silence, however, she was carefully storing away every moment of betrayal, letting each wound fester into something darker than sadness. It wasn't anger she carried. It was patience, the kind of patience that grows sharp with time. The truth came to light when Robert's affair spiraled into something no one could have predicted. His mistress, a woman much younger than Linda, disappeared one evening without explanation. At first, it was just whispers in town, hushed conversations at the grocery store, neighbors speculating over fences. But soon, investigators became involved, piecing together the events leading up to the woman's disappearance. Evidence pointed directly to Robert. Witnesses recalled seeing him with her the night she went missing, and his fingerprints were found in her abandoned car. The case snowballed quickly, and before Robert could fully grasp the weight of it, he was facing charges of murder. Even though the woman's body was never recovered, the trial drew attention far beyond their neighborhood. People who had once admired Robert's charm now gathered outside the courthouse, eager to see justice served. The prosecution painted him as a man who lived a double life, consumed by secrets and lies. The defense fought to portray him as a victim of circumstance, but the evidence told a different story. The jury didn't need long to deliberate. When the verdict was read, guilty of murder, Robert's fate was sealed. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a punishment that seemed both shocking and inevitable to those who had followed the case. Linda sat in the courtroom that day, her face pale but expressionless. She did not weep as otherwise might have. She did not collapse under the weight of public shame or humiliation. Instead, she stared at her husband with cold eyes that betrayed nothing of the storm raging within her. To those around her, she appeared broken, a victim of her husband's selfishness, a woman left to pick up the shattered pieces of her life. But inside, Linda was already building something new. Most assumed she would file for divorce, cut her losses, and move on with her life. Others thought she might retreat into solitude, living out her days quietly without him. But Linda had no interest in starting over. She had spent too many years swallowing her pain, too many nights lying awake while Robert betrayed her trust. Divorce would be too clean, too simple. What she carried inside her demanded something more. As Robert was led away in handcuffs, she made a silent promise to herself. His punishment was not over, not by a long shot. 15 years is a long time to wait, and for most, it would be unthinkable. But for Linda, it was nothing more than a countdown. She was not impulsive, not reckless, and certainly not careless. If she was going to finish what fate had started, she would do it with precision, in her own time, and in her own way. Robert may have been sentenced by the court, but Linda had already sentenced him in her heart. His release would not mean freedom. It would mean the beginning of the end. As she walked out of the courthouse that day, reporters tried to capture her expression, desperate for a glimpse into the mind of the betrayed wife. But Linda gave them nothing. No words, no tears, no signs of anger. Only silence. And within that silence lay a secret more dangerous than anyone could have guessed. She would wait, she would plan, and when the time came, Robert Turner would face a reckoning far greater than any prison walls could deliver. While Robert adjusted to his new life behind bars, Linda settled into her own kind of prison. To the world, she appeared as a woman burdened with shame and loss, the loyal wife of a convicted murderer. She wore plain clothes, spoke softly in public, and carried herself with the demeanor of someone who had been broken by circumstance. Neighbors whispered about how brave she was to stand by him, to still visit him, to bring him comfort when no one else would. They saw a woman clinging to the remnants of a ruined marriage, but they were seeing only what she wanted them to see. In reality, Linda was cultivating something far more dangerous. The day Robert was sentenced, she made a decision that changed the trajectory of her life. She would wait. She would bide her time, play her role to perfection, and when the day came that Robert finally walked free, she would be there, not as the forgiving wife, but as the executioner he never saw coming. Every action she took over the following years was designed to protect that secret. She began by building an image of loyalty. Every holiday, she sent him cards. Every month, she visited him in prison, sitting across the cold metal table with a forced smile, listening as he complained about the conditions inside or reminisced about his life before the trial. She never let him see her indifference. Instead, she painted herself as the one person who had not abandoned him. Her letters were filled with warm words of encouragement, subtle reminders that she would be waiting for him when he came home. For Robert, those letters were lifelines. For Linda, they were pieces of bait, ensuring that when the time came, he would trust her completely. Behind the curtains of her carefully staged loyalty, Linda was preparing in ways no one would suspect. She began reading obsessively, drawn to books about unsolved crimes, mysterious poisonings, and forensic failures. She clipped newspaper articles about suspicious deaths and tucked them into a small box in the back of her closet. At local community centers, she attended free talks on crime prevention and investigative techniques, sitting quietly in the back and taking mental notes. No one questioned her interest. After all, she had every reason to be curious about criminal justice. What they didn't realize was that she wasn't seeking comfort. She was gathering knowledge. Each year that passed added another layer of calculation to her plan. She studied the kinds of mistakes that caused criminals to get caught, determined not to repeat them. She learned that the most effective killers were those who appeared utterly incapable of violence, those who lived quiet lives and hid in plain sight. And so she leaned even further into her role as the fragile, grieving wife. She joined community groups, attended church events, and volunteered occasionally, all to reinforce the idea that she was harmless. Inside her home, however, she was far from harmless. She rehearsed scenarios in her mind, playing out what she would do and how she would cover her tracks. She made lists, then destroyed them. She researched poisons and natural causes of death, memorizing symptoms and side effects, teaching herself how to create the illusion of tragedy instead of murder. She learned patience in ways most people could never understand. 15 years would have broken some, driven others mad. But for Linda, the long wait was not a burden. It was fueled. As Robert endured his sentence, Linda maintained her visits with mechanical precision. She brought him small gifts like books or toiletries, always careful to reinforce her image as the loyal partner. Prison staff admired her dedication, often commenting on how rare it was for a wife to remain faithful under such circumstances. Robert himself began to believe in her devotion. He told other inmates that his wife was waiting for him, that their marriage would survive, that he was lucky to have her. He carried that belief like a badge of honor, never realizing it was a carefully constructed lie. For Linda, the years seemed to pass both quickly and agonizingly slow. Each milestone, the 5th year, the 10th, the 13th, reminded her that she was drawing closer to the moment she had been preparing for. She was not content to simply let time do the work. She used every year to sharpen her plan, ensuring that when Robert's release day arrived, there would be no hesitation, no mistakes, and no possibility of discovery. By the time Robert's sentence neared its end, Linda had perfected her disguise. She was seen as a woman of remarkable loyalty, the kind of person others admired for her strength. Friends confided in her, neighbors praised her resilience, and the community saw her as someone who had endured the unendurable. Nobody suspected that beneath her calm surface lay a storm of vengeance, honed by years of quiet study and fueled by betrayal that had never been forgotten. When the release date appeared on the horizon, Linda did not panic. She did not rush or second-guess herself. Instead, she felt a steady calm wash over her, the kind of calm that comes from knowing the wait is almost over. To Robert, freedom meant a new beginning, a chance to reclaim the life he had lost. To Linda, his freedom meant something entirely different. It meant the stage was finally set, and the ending she had been writing for 15 years was about to unfold exactly as she intended. Robert Turner stepped out of prison 15 years older, his once broad shoulders slightly hunched, his face lined with years of confinement. He inhaled the air like it was his first breath, savoring the freedom he had long dreamed of. The world had changed since the day he was sentenced, but Robert's mind clung to the belief that some things remained the same. Chief among them was his wife. To him, Linda had been the anchor that tethered him to the outside world. Her letters, her visits, her carefully chosen words of encouragement, all of it had convinced him that she still loved him. He believed her loyalty was proof that their marriage, though scarred, was intact. When he walked into their modest suburban home for the first time in a decade and a half, Linda welcomed him with the same quiet smile she had perfected long ago. The neighbors, who had long whispered about her unwavering devotion, watched with admiration. They spoke of her strength, of her ability to forgive, of the rare bond between two people who had endured so much. To outsiders, it was the story of a marriage reborn. For Robert, it was his second chance at a life he thought he had lost. For Linda, it was the final act of a play she had been scripting in silence. First, everything seemed ordinary. Linda cooked meals and sat with him at the dinner table, listening as he recounted stories from prison life. He told her about the men he had met, the fights he had avoided, the way he had survived behind the walls. He confessed that her visits had kept him sane, her letters had given him hope. Linda nodded and listened, her expression soft and calm, as though she were absorbing every word. What Robert didn't see was that behind her eyes, she was watching him the way a hunter studies prey. She noted his routines, his weaknesses, and his newfound vulnerabilities. He was slower now, more tired, and far less guarded than he had once been. To Linda, these were not just observations. They were opportunities. The neighbors often saw them walking in the evenings, Robert's arm occasionally brushing against Linda's as they strolled down the quiet streets. Some said it was touching to see them together again after all these years. They whispered about resilience, about love that could endure even betrayal and prison bars. What they couldn't know was that Linda was carefully cultivating this image. For their benefit, every walk, every smile, every small gesture of affection was a calculated move, designed to convince the world, and Robert, that forgiveness had triumphed. Inside the house, Linda maintained the same careful act. She brought him coffee in the mornings, asked about his plans, and pretended to share in his cautious optimism for the future. Robert began talking about finding work again, rebuilding his life, and maybe even taking a short trip to mark the beginning of his freedom. He was unaware that Linda had been rehearsing her own trip, her own ending, long before he spoke of any plans. Robert felt relief in her company, mistaking her calmness for devotion. Years in prison had made him wary of betrayal, but Linda's consistency erased his suspicions. He believed he had been forgiven, that his sins had been buried with the past. To him, Linda's patience was proof of love. To Linda, it was proof that her disguise was flawless. She needed him to believe in her, to trust her completely, so that when the time came, he would never see it coming. The days stretched into weeks. Robert fell into a rhythm of comfort, while Linda grew sharper. In her focus, she tested him with small gestures, like offering him extra servings of food, pouring his drinks, and handling the details of their household. He accepted it all without hesitation, never once questioning her motives. This was the confirmation Linda had been waiting for. He trusted her, and that trust would become his undoing. The community, blind to the truth, began to speak of them as an example of loyalty. People admired Linda's strength and Robert's apparent humility after prison. Friends invited them to dinners, Church groups welcomed them back, and neighbors spoke kindly of the couple who had survived scandal and punishment. Each word of admiration only strengthened Linda's resolve. The more others saw her as devoted, the safer she felt in her secret plan. No one would suspect the grieving widow when the time finally came. Robert often lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, grateful to be home. He sometimes reached for Linda's hand, whispering his thanks for standing by him. She responded with the same calm smile, hiding the fact that every word of gratitude fueled her cold determination. For Robert, these were the first steps of a new life. For Linda, they were the final steps of a countdown that was nearly complete. The stage was set. Robert believed he was safe, protected by the woman who had waited for him. But what he saw as love was only a mask, perfected over 15 years of silence and strategy. Linda's moment was coming, and she was ready. The day Linda had been waiting for arrived under the guise of celebration. Robert had been free for a few months, and life seemed to be smoothing into a rhythm that he believed was normal. He talked about rebuilding their marriage, about small joys he wanted to rediscover, and about a future that felt within reach. To Robert, Linda's willingness to share meals, walks, and quiet evenings meant the worst was behind them. He thought the years of betrayal, scandal, and prison were buried. For Linda, however, the years of waiting were about to end in the way. She had always envisioned that it was Linda who suggested they take a trip together, something quiet and intimate to mark a fresh start. She framed it as a chance to reconnect away from the eyes of neighbors and the whispers that still lingered in the community. Robert welcomed the idea, grateful for what seemed like her forgiveness. He saw it as a chance to leave behind the shadow of his conviction. He did not see it for what it really was. The final piece of Linda's carefully laid plan. The cabin she booked was tucked deep in the woods, secluded and silent. The drive itself set the tone, miles of winding roads, tall trees closing in on either side, and no sign of neighbors for what seemed like forever. To Robert, the isolation felt freeing, a rare chance to be alone with the woman who had stood by him. To Linda, it was perfect. The forest would keep its secrets, and there would be no curious eyes to notice if something went wrong. Inside, the cabin was rustic but cozy. A stone fireplace, creaking wooden floors, and dim lighting gave it a sense of warmth that put Robert at ease. Linda had arrived prepared. She brought groceries, wine, and small touches that made the cabin feel less like a rental and more like a home. Robert was touched by the effort, mistaking it as a gesture of devotion. He relaxed completely, never once questioning her motives. The evening unfolded with an unsettling kind of perfection. Linda prepared dinner, roasting meat and vegetables, while Robert poured wine and talked about how good it felt to be free. He told her about the things he wanted to do: find steady work, visit old friends, maybe even travel somewhere sunny. Linda listened quietly, nodding at the right moments, smiling softly as though his words meant something to her. What he didn't see was the calculation behind her silence. She was waiting for the right moment, the right pause, the right opportunity to act. When she poured the wine, she did so with steady hands, filling both glasses and sliding his toward him with practiced ease. Robert raised his glass, thanking her for her loyalty, never realizing that the words he spoke sealed his fate. The liquid he swallowed carried with it the result of Linda's years of study. She had chosen her method carefully, selecting something that would weaken his body without leaving obvious traces. It was a quiet weapon, as patient and unforgiving as she was. At first, Robert noticed nothing. He ate, drank, and laughed softly at his own jokes, leaning back in his chair with a satisfaction that came from believing he had survived the worst. Linda sat across from him, watching every movement, every expression, waiting for the shift she knew was coming. Then it began. His laughter faded into a cough, his face tightening with confusion as his body betrayed him. His hand trembled as he reached for the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. The color drained from his face, his breaths growing shallow, uneven. He looked at Linda with wide eyes, searching for reassurance, for comfort, for anything that might explain what was happening. She did not move. She watched him calmly, her expression unchanged, as if she were finally witnessing the moment she had lived for over 15 years. Robert tried to rise, but his strength failed him. His legs buckled, his body collapsing against the floorboards. With a heavy thud, he struggled to speak, but no sound came. His chest heaved, his limbs twitched, and slowly, the life drained from his eyes. Linda stood silently, neither rushing to his side nor turning away. She had imagined this moment for so long, and now it was here. For her, there was no fear, no panic, no regret. There was only relief. The man who had betrayed her, humiliated her, and left her in the shadow of his crimes was gone. The years of waiting, the endless visits, the carefully crafted mask of loyalty, all of it had led to this. When the cabin fell silent again, Linda moved with precision. She washed the dishes, cleaned the glasses, and placed everything neatly back where it belonged. She arranged Robert's body to look as though he had collapsed from exhaustion, his glass toppled beside him. The isolation of the cabin meant no one had heard his struggle. No one would question the timeline. That be why morning, Linda would call for help. She would play the role she had rehearsed for years, the devastated wife who had lost her husband to failing health after years of hardship. Those who saw her would pity her, never suspecting the truth. And when Robert's body was carried out of the cabin, Linda would know that her long wait was over, and that she had finally written the ending herself. The news of Robert Turner's death spread quietly, almost without fanfare. To most people, he was a convicted murderer who had served his time and returned home only to suffer an untimely end. His past overshadowed his death, and few beyond his immediate circle cared enough to question it. When Linda made the call from the cabin, her voice trembled with just the right balance of panic and grief. She told them she had woken to find Robert on the floor, unresponsive, his glass tipped over beside him. By the time emergency responders arrived, he was long gone. The cause of death seemed obvious to the authorities. 15 years in prison had worn his body down. Stress, poor nutrition, and years of confinement had taken their toll. The official report listed heart failure, a natural tragedy, but not suspicious. Linda was praised for her composure and her loyalty. She played the grieving widow convincingly, weeping softly when spoken to, clutching her hands together as though holding herself upright took all the strength she had left. Nobody doubted her story. Back in their suburban neighborhood, the news drew sympathy rather than suspicion. Neighbors brought flowers, casseroles, and soft words of comfort. They spoke about Linda's strength, how she had endured years of humiliation and stood by her husband anyway. They admired her loyalty, calling her an example of forgiveness. No one saw the truth behind her calm face, that she was not mourning at all, but savoring the completion of a plan she had nurtured in silence for 15 long years. The funeral was small and subdued. Robert's family, distant and bitter, attended but said little. They still carried resentment for the shame his crime had brought, and their condolences to Linda were stiff, mechanical. Friends who had once admired Robert's charisma stayed away, unwilling to be reminded of his scandal. Linda, dressed in black with a veil covering her face, accepted the few condolences with bowed head and whispered thanks. She appeared fragile, almost ghost-like, her performance flawless. Every gesture reinforced the image she had built for so long. A woman loyal until the very end. Behind closed doors, Linda felt no sorrow. She felt freedom. She moved through her house with a quietness that came not from grief, but from satisfaction. The rooms that had once felt suffocating with Robert's presence now felt open, breathable. She no longer had to endure his arrogance, his betrayals, his shadow looming over her life. For the first time in decades, she was truly alone, and she welcomed the silence. Authorities closed the case quickly. There was no autopsy beyond the standard report, no deeper investigation. Linda had left nothing to question. The poison she had chosen mimicked natural failure, and the isolation of the cabin meant there were no witnesses to contradict her story. She had executed her plan with precision, leaving behind only the image of a wife devastated by fate's cruelty. The more people praised her loyalty, the more untouchable she became. As weeks turned into months, Linda returned to a routine that seemed outwardly normal. She attended community gatherings again, accepted invitations from neighbors, and spoke in soft tones about the difficulty of adjusting to life without Robert. People looked at her with sympathy, never suspicion. They admired her resilience, her ability to keep going despite the weight of loss. The truth, however, was that Linda felt lighter than she ever had. Occasionally, She thought back to the trial, to the moment Robert had been led away in handcuffs, and to the promise she had made to herself that day. She remembered the long years of waiting, the endless visits, the carefully written letters. She had played her role so well that even Robert himself had believed in her love until the very end. That was the part she cherished most, not the act of killing him, but the knowledge that he had walked into her trap willingly, blind to the truth until it was too late. To the outside world, Linda Turner remained a tragic figure, a woman who had lived through betrayal, scandal, prison, and loss. People spoke of her in hushed tones, admiring her endurance. They never saw the truth that lived quietly behind her eyes. She was not broken, not wounded, not grieving. She was victorious. Robert had paid for his crimes in the eyes of the law with 15 years behind bars. But in Linda's eyes, his true punishment had only come when she decided the time was right. She had waited with patience that most would never understand, holding her vengeance close, nurturing it like a seed until it grew into something unshakable. When the moment arrived, she did not hesitate, and she did not falter. Her secret was buried with Robert. No one would ever know the truth of what had happened in that cabin, and no one would ever suspect her. The story the world believed was one of tragic love and cruel fate, and Linda was content to let them believe it. In her heart, she carried a different story, one that belonged only to her. The story of a woman who waited 15 years for justice, of her own making, and who had delivered it with quiet precision. For Linda Turner, life after Robert was not a continuation. It was a beginning.